Ritchie. He's worked in cultural resource management since 1976. He joined the Public Archaeology Laboratory, also called PAL, in 1982. His formal training in anthropology was at the University of New Mexico, Franklin Pierce College, and Brown University. And he has many areas of expertise. They include New England pre-contact period, historical archaeology, pre-contact and post-contact modern period use of geological resources, which I find interesting, geology and mineralogy of the Northeast, and ethnohistory. Another area of his interest is working and supporting community-based groups as they preserve and study historic and archaeological sites in Massachusetts. And since 1978, he's been a technical advisor to the Wayland Archaeology Group and the Wayland Historical Commission. And that's some of what he's going to talk about today. And here in Acton, he worked on the archaeological recovery for the Pine Hawk site, developed educational videos, worked on a great display, interactive display that we have showing the archaeological findings there. And then in 1929, he directed a townwide archaeological reconnaissance survey of Acton. And that we recently enacted a law that allows town boards and commissions to review new development and the potential impacts on cultural resources. And we're one of the first to have that. So we're really thrilled to have Duncan to give the talk, and I'll let him take over.
Thanks Bob and Denise and everybody from Friends of Pine Hawk for inviting me. It's nice to be back in Acton. It's kind of one of my other hometowns up here when I get out of Rhode Island. Does it sound good?
Sound looks good. We wanted to use this camera
Okay.
instead of this one, which keeps panning the audience. So. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
You're on TV.
Yeah. So as Denise said, tonight I'll be talking about the Sand Hill site, which has been a very long-term project by the Wayland Archaeology Group. We're at 40 years plus, I think. And we're also honored tonight to have with us a founding member of the Wayland Archaeology Group, Tanya Largy, right here. Lots of credit. So this is the Wayland Archaeology Group, through a lot of coordination with the town of Wayland, was able to do essentially archaeological data recovery or mitigation on two really significant Native American archaeological sites. The project that really kicked off the Wayland Archaeology Group was the Castle Hill site, and Tanya was instrumental in that. And that's what, 1978? That started.
We were in the field, yeah.
Yep, and that ran for a few years, and there was professional collaboration. Faculty from UMass Boston came out and supported that. I think they held the permit, the state permit on that.
Did.
And that really got things going. And then later on, the interest moved to the Sand Hill site, which is, both of these sites, by the way, are on town-owned land, not private property. So it was all about coordination and getting permission and some understanding with town boards and commissions of what the Wayland Archaeology Group wanted to do. And I'm sure Tanya you could do a whole presentation on that. Next slide. Oh, there we go. It's okay on the left. Okay. So the environmental setting of the Sand Hill site, it's right along the Sudbury River, between where routes 20 and Route 27 cross the river. And this is actually, I think, a view from the Wayland side of the river looking west across towards Sudbury. So it's that part of the Sudbury River drainage where you start to have these really broad river meadows and marshes. The meadows really open up. And it's also, that's also part of Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. So the Sandhill site is on town land, but it abuts federal property, federal refuge property. So the Sandhill site is kind of over that way. And the physical location of it, it's on the crest and upper slopes of a glacial feature that's called an esker. And basically what that is, it's a relict stream or river channel. So when glacial ice melted and there were crevices, cracks in the ice, and these meltwater streams ran through it, you get these narrow ridges of stratified sand and gravel. And there are probably there's examples in most towns around here. There are these long, sort of winding, narrow ridges. And this is not really a typical site location for a large Native American site because there's not a lot of flat area. This site was on the crest and upper slopes, and part of it was probably on the lower slopes of the esker. And here you can see, this is a gravel pit that the town of Wayland opened, and you can see in the wall of the pit, you can see some of that stratified sand and gravel glacial outwash. This is just shows where it is on a topographic map. The sites, here's the Esker Ridge containing the Sandhill site. This is all, most of this is town-owned land. This is an older 1960s era topo map. But the critical thing, I think, that attracted a lot of Native American activity to the site is just this orientation. So the river meadows are really wide. I mean, in some places they're up to a mile wide. There's very few points where you can access the river channel on dry ground. So this is really, from a logistical standpoint, it's really a key feature. So you could walk on dry ground almost right to the river channel. And the other places I've seen that are like that, that's where you had thousands of years of Native American activity. That would have also been a really good point to set up fish traps and weirs. So the Sudbury River would have supported seasonal runs of, salmon, shad, alewives, eels, we know. So it would also be really well situated for fishing. And there's some historical references in the history of Sudbury. If you've ever read Hudson's 1889 History of Sudbury, there's some references to the Sandhill area. Sandhill, at least along the Sudbury Wayland town line, is actually this way. And I picked out a few references. There's a reference to an Indian hemlock swamp that I've seen, which I think might be this in here. It's off the map here, but there's mention of an Indian bridge that connected Sandhill going south across the mouth of Hop Brook to the Herd Pond, Pelham Island area, which also was a major focus of Native American activity. And Hudson mentions a burial, Native American burial that was found in the mid to late 19th century when the Boston Post Road was cut across the crest of Sandhill, so probably over in here. This is the modern Route 20. So there was clearly a lot of, if this information was around in the 19th century, it was clearly an area that was a focus of thousands of years of Native American antiquity. I think also, I know on the Sudbury side, there's a militia training field on Old County Road, and it's up on the top, the flat part of Sandhill. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was native planting fields, let's say in the late prehistoric, early historic period. So that's the setting of the site. This is before, I know this topo map is probably 1965, so it's before really there had been any modification of this. The Wayland Town Dump used to be over here on the south side of Route 20, but in 1978, they purchased a parcel of land in here. And that's, besides the gravel pits, that's when you really start to see this being completely altered. And there's cutting and filling. So here's kind of the rough sequence of the way things happen. So as I mentioned, in 1978, the town of Wayland acquired this parcel of land from private owners that included the Sand Hill Archaeological Site. And the town wanted it for a new landfill and for the sand and gravel deposits. It's Wayland DPW. And I actually just looked online. I actually found the deed, the 1978 deed where the town takes it.
Ah,
And there's a really great map that shows the parcel. I just found that. Just
that's
looking.
great.
So the town acquired the land. One of the first things they did was to build a new access road to the new landfill. And a local avocational archaeologist went out there and noticed a Native American fire pit feature in the bed of the new access road. And there were some artifacts scattered around it. So he salvaged material out of that. And that's when it sort of came to our attention. Well, probably to Tanya's attention first. And I know I went out there once.
Karen Langthorne noticed
Right.
the big feature eroding out of the pit.
Right.
It was half gone and we
Right.
salvaged the rest of it.
Karen Langthorne was coordinator for the Wayland Archaeology Group, probably around 1982, somewhere
Yeah.
around in there.
82 to
Yeah.
83 or so.
Yep, thanks. So that's what really kicked it off. So then the Wayland Archaeology Group approached the town to ask permission to basically do salvage archaeology mitigation on the archaeological site, the Sand Hill site, and the town agreed. I guess it would have been DPW, Public Works,
Yeah,
Wayland Public Works probably. I think the agreement was the town would continue to extract sand and gravel, but they would give the group time to work on the site. And as it turned out, it extended for what, 20+ years. It was a very extended period of time that the group was allowed to work on the site. In 1980, 81, the Wayland Historical Commission got a matching grant from the Massachusetts Historical Commission to do a townwide archaeological reconnaissance survey. And I was able to work on that. And one of the things that we did was to go around the town and check on the condition of the sites that were already recorded in the state's inventory, but also record sites that were known but not documented or newly discovered. So in the course of that, the site, which at that time was called Town Dump 1, was recorded with the Mass Historical Commission, the MHC, and they gave it the number 19MD456. So that's a Smithsonian institution numbering system I believe that's nationwide. Is that, am I correct? I think so. So 19 is the number for Massachusetts, MD is for Middlesex County, and it's the 456th site in Middlesex County. Pre-contact Native American site, that is. So once we got it on the MHC statewide inventory, then, that really gave it some, a different kind of standing. And then from that point on, Wayland Archaeology Group coordinators get permission from the town, as I mentioned, to do seasonal archaeological field work on the attack portion of the site, which was the crest of the Esker Ridge at that point, because the town had pretty well extracted the western slope of it. So there's a slide of some of the Wayland Archaeology Group volunteers working on the site. And the first phase was a lot of test sampling with hand dug test pits. I think they were probably all 50 by 50 centimeter hand dug test pits, just to really get a handle on how big the site was. We didn't really know the full boundaries of it on the town land. To identify concentrations of cultural material and any features. So features are things like fire pits, stone tool making workshops, concentrations of burned rock. So 90 test pits were dug over that 3-year period, 1983 to 86. From 88 to 90, some larger trenches were excavated and parts of the site where features and interesting artifacts had been found, concentrations of cultural material. 83 to 86, 29 1 meter square excavation units were hand excavated. And 1990 to 2010, which is the last stage of work, focused on broad horizontal exposure with contiguous 1 meter square units. And a pretty astounding amount of area was excavated, 520 square meters. That's a lot of area for an archaeological excavation. From 83 to 2010, 520 square meters total. So this is kind of the sampling strategy. So the Wayland Archaeology Group would pretty much run it as a field school, is that safe to say? So they would announce in the springtime that people that were interested in volunteering could come out to the site on weekends. And whoever was the coordinator would be on the site and would teach, if they didn't know, would teach them basic archaeological skills, how to recognize Native American cultural material, how to do the paperwork, and do the proper recording. This is a map of the test pit sampling stage. So the red line was the limit of the gravel pit at that point. And you can see how it's taken a pretty big bite out of the western slope of the site.
Duncan, the
Yeah.
people online can't see you pointing.
Okay. If I stand over here?
No, no.
The only camera they see is the one
All right.
in
well,
that,
Yeah. all
it's
right.
that one in the computer.
The red line.
Yeah, all right, yeah, they look at the red line. That's the limit of disturbance from sand and gravel pitting. It's a little hard to see, but you can see the test pits. So they were really distributed out. So I think the outcome of that was that was determined that this was a large site. I mean, was thousands of square meters contained within this archaeological site. And the testing only went to the boundary between town-owned land and federal land, so federal Great Meadows Wildlife Refuge land. So I think that's what we're looking at here. There we go. This is a map. It's a little tough to see the units, but I'll show you detail. In the excavation unit stage. So this is when the excavation focused on the identified concentrations of cultural material and features. And you can see that it was this contiguous block area excavation focused up on the crest of the Esker Ridge. And the elevation looks like it's 153 feet above sea level at the highest point. And I have a detail. This is a detail of the contiguous 1 meter excavation units. They look like rectangles because I had to kind of compress the original graphic to fit it in the slide. But you can see how many units that is. I mean, in professional cultural resource management, this would be like we don't even get anywhere near to this amount of excavation. This is a massive amount of hand excavation. So you can see it's over that period, 1990 to 2000, for about a 14-year period. So, I mean, the commitment by the Wayland Archaeology Group to this project is just pretty amazing in its own right. To do this every year.
Duncan, that was mostly Paul during that time.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that? We can't hear it.
The,
People on Zoom can't hear the audience.
Okay.
So you have to repeat.
The question was, Tanya was just pointing out to me that in that phase of work, Paul Gardescu was the coordinator of the Wayland Archaeology Group. So the coordinator position, I think it started with probably Bobby Robinson, and
No,
then
Linda
Karen.
Toll helped us get
Yeah.
started with
Yeah,
Karen.
Karen
Yeah,
Langthorne,
at this site.
right.
That's right.
And then Paul Gardescu was the coordinator for many years, and he was the one who was primarily out here directing for the Wayland Archaeology Group. I took some of the data the numbers from the Sand Hill site collection, which actually, by the way, one of the other wonderful things that the Wayland Archaeology Group was able to do was they were able to get the town to give them a room in the Wayland Town building, which has been an archaeological laboratory for
We have two now,
Tanya tells me 2 rooms now for what, over 40 years,
yeah.
continuously. So that's really helped a lot to contribute to the stability of the group. So that's pretty much a permanent long-term curation and also processing where artifacts came in and were washed, cleaned, identified, and cataloged. So that's really been great for the town did that. It really contributed a lot to this project and other Wayland Archaeology Group projects. So what I did was to look at some of the metrics, some of the numbers of the Sand Hill site, and I compared it to the Pine Hawk site. So as most of you know, the town of Acton built a wastewater treatment plant on the Sudbury River, and that was a federally funded project, so it went through the full review, and the company I work for, PAL, we took that from survey to data recovery or mitigation. And these numbers are from the data recovery or mitigation stage on the Pine Hawk site. Just to give you some comparison, so the thing about the Sand Hill site is, I mean, a larger area, it's a larger site, a larger sample of it was excavated, and the time frame was gigantic. It was 20 years. But one of the things that's really clear, even despite that, the amount of cultural material that was recovered from that site, and there's still parts of it left. It wasn't completely excavated. The numbers are gigantic. So when you look at, so the Sand Hill site was 7,200 square meters. Pine Hawk, we know, was about 3,300 square meters. Sand Hill, 520 square meters, or 7.2% excavated. Pine Hawk, a little more than half, only 158 square meters, 4.7%. But when you look at the lithic and ceramic assemblage from Sand Hill, 29,800 items. That's just an astronomical amount of material. So a professional data recovery at Pine Hawk, 7,100 lithic and ceramic artifacts, just to give you some sense of scale. Sand Hill, over 28,000 pieces of chipping debris. Those are the little flakes of stone from stone tool making. Pine Hawk, 7,000. Total chipped, grounded, and rough stone tools. Sand Hill, 1,643. Pine Hawk, 173. Sand Hill, Native American ceramic vessel sherds, 70, only 3 from Pine Hawk. That's a significant aspect of the artifact assemblage from Sand Hill, is the number of Native American ceramic sherds, because in this area, that's something we just don't find a lot of. And when we find them, they're usually pretty small, an inch or so in size. So that's a really large ceramic assemblage from Sand Hill. Faunal remains, 920 pieces of calcined bone from Sand Hill, 145 from Pine Hawk. Charcoal samples, 250, which is a huge number from Sand Hill, 30 from Pine Hawk. And you can see the soil samples, 47 Sand Hill, 122 Pine Hawk. So I guess the point is that the thing that strikes me about the Sand Hill site is because of the amount of excavation, we really have a good sense of really how much cultural material, like how much artifactual material is in one of these large pre-contact Native American sites that was occupied for thousands of years. I mean, it's an astronomical amount of material. And, just as a side note, many of these large sites like this have already been destroyed. So this is really important documentation. Question?
Yes, what constitutes charcoal samples?
So in the course of.
Repeat the question.
Oh, okay. The question was, what constitutes a charcoal sample? So when you're doing archaeology, if you're thinking about doing radiocarbon dating of parts or all of the site. You collect charcoal samples from during excavation, and the idea is to collect the charcoal from specific features or context, physical context within the site. So we would normally collect charcoal samples from a discrete fire pit feature or a deep pit feature. We wouldn't usually collect charcoal that's just scattered around in the general soil horizons. Because what you want to do with the radiocarbon dates is to date an occupation on the site, you know, like get a snapshot of an occupation on the site. Other questions?
Yeah, how old are the sites? Are they the same age?
They're,
Can you repeat the question?
the question is, how old are these sites? Is that correct?
Yes, and then are they the same age?
They have approximately the same occupation span. So both of these sites were occupied from, let's say, at least 7,000 years ago up to, in the case of the Sand Hill site, possibly right into the 17th century, into the early historic period. Pine Hawk probably was only occupied until maybe 1,000 years ago. So they do have very comparable occupation spans. And then there was another question.
Well, what sort of ceramic vessels were used by the natives?
So the question was, what types of ceramic vessels were used by Native Americans? So they would use local clay, probably mostly extracted from, you know, wetlands. There's some really good clay that's in old glacial lake bottom deposits. I know along the Sudbury River, probably the Assabet. They would collect that clay, clean it, process it, mix some kind of tempering material into it. Around here, it's usually a lot of crushed, burned granite, and then hand form these vessels using a coiling technique. If you know it, anybody knows anything about ceramic, about potting. Yeah, it's a coil construction usually. And they're fired at a pretty low temperature. So it's the equivalent of, let's say, a modern porous earthenware. I mean, they're not even the equivalent of, let's say, 18th century brick. You know, it's a pretty low firing temperature because you're firing with charcoal, basically. So the vessels are end up being a porous earthenware. But you know, apparently they worked well. They were serviceable, but probably fragile because, you know, we find the other thing about ceramics was they only manufactured them in what we call the Woodland Period. So Native American ceramic manufacture around here, the earliest would be, I don't know, maybe 2,500 at the oldest, 3,000 years ago, and then up into, you know, the early historic period. So it's kind of in the latter part of prehistory. So anyway, that's just to give you a sense of the amount of material, artifacts and culture material that were in the Sand Hill, even a part of the Sand Hill site. So in 2014, the Public Archaeology Lab, PAL, did a joint project with the Wayland Historical Commission, and the commission was able to get some community CPA money, whatever, what is that, community planning? Preservation money. So curation of the Sand Hill site collection is massive. So curation was already, you know, an issue. So what we did a little pilot study, a little feasibility study, and we took a piece of the Sand Hill site collection and we brought it to the Public Archaeology Lab, which is down in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and we cataloged it on the system that we use at PAL, which is we call it a relational database, but basically it's a digital catalog. Sand Hill had been cataloged with a handwritten catalog, but it was what PAL used back in the 80s. So the catalog systems were very comparable. But what we did was we took a bunch of material from the 1991 field season, on the Sandhill site and cataloged it at PAL just to see what the numbers were and just to see how long did it take, how long would it take if it was ever considered to do a digital catalog of the entire Sandhill site collection. So we ran some tables out of that. So this is all chipping debris by lithic material and size. This is just the 1991 field season at Sandhill. So again, it's a very large number. 5,688 pieces just from 1 year's work. And the breakdown by lithic material, you can see kind of in the center of the chart, as is usually the case around here, quartz is the most common material that was used for tool making because there's a lot of it around. It's easy to obtain. Quartzite, which is also a local material to the whole Sudbury Assabet drainage, is probably second in frequency. And rhyolite. So the sources of rhyolite are up in the Middlesex Fells area, so north of Boston, and in the Blue Hills, if you're familiar with that area down in Milton. So rhyolites from those source areas are important materials for Native Americans in the local area. So those are the primary lithic materials that you can see in the numbers in the middle of the chart. The other thing, myelinite, which is, we were talking about this during dinner. There's a fault zone that runs kind of southwest and northeast across the Suwasco drainage called the Bloody Bluff Fault. And one portion of it runs through the town of Sudbury from Knobscot Hill diagonally, and Bloody Bluff is actually a battle site in Minuteman National Historic Park. The fault zone runs right through it, but along that fault zone, there's a type of rock that the geologists call myelinite. So rock was crushed and ground to dust by grinding action along the fault plane, and then it was reconstituted back together, and it's a very silica-rich rock, and it breaks in flat plates. So the Native Americans discovered that early on, by 7,000 years ago. They're already using it. It's really well suited for tool making, but it's a very local material. So in Sand Hill, there's 600, just in the 91 season, 631 pieces of myelinite. So that's of interest to us because it's such a local material. You know, we can say, you know, they really targeted this resource. So those are the kinds of things. Another table. Oh. Well, anyway, let's go with this. So this is projectile points by type and lithic material from the 1991 excavations at Sand Hill. These are on the left, the object type. Those are diagnostic projectile points. So projectile points are spear. You think of them as spear and arrow points. Most of these are actually large, so there's spear points. And there's a typology that has been developed in New England, and those are the names that you see. So there are diagnostic projectile point styles for the time period. So early Archaic, Middle Archaic, Late Archaic. And that's how this table's divided up. So like at the top, Atlantic projectile points, those are from about 3,900 to, let's say, 3,600 years ago. There was only 2 of those. We know on Sand Hill, there was a lot of activity in the Middle Archaic period, so 7,500 to about 5,000 years ago. And a lot of really intense activity in the Late Archaic period. So when you see all these small stem projectile points, so there's 33, 37, 40 plus small stem projectile points, that's all reflecting an episode of Late Archaic period activity on the site. So roughly 4,500 to 3,000 years ago. So 181 total projectile points, that's a lot. There are professional cultural resource management investigations. That would be all you would find for the entire investigation. So again, just an indication of the density of artifacts and artifacts from different time periods in the Sandhill site. Is there another way to advance this?
You've advanced.
Oh, okay. So just try to go quickly through the different categories of cultural material on the sand that were found on the Sandhill site. Chipping debris, as you saw in that breakdown, there was over 28,000 pieces of chipping debris. It's the most common piece of pre-contact period Native American cultural material that we find when we work on these sites. And as I said, quartz is one of the most common materials because it's local. Myelinite and quartzite are local. There's another material that's again very local to the Sudbury, Maynard, Marlborough area called amphibolite. And that material is workable to make stone tools out of. You just have to learn how to use it. It's a little bit tricky. But we're interested in it because it's one of these very distinctly local materials. So there was amphibolite in the chipping debris from Sandhill. And as I mentioned, the rhyolites from the different source areas, Middlesex Fells, Wakefield, Saugus, Blue Hills, Milton area. Argillite, which is a slaty rock. I'm guessing it's probably from the Cambridge or Arlington area where we know there's bedrock like that. There's also material called Braintree slate, which is from the Blue Hills area, and a small amount of chert, which is what archaeologists and geologists call flint. I mean, flint is mostly we think of as from European sources. North American stuff we call chert. That is actually cryptocrystalline quartz. And the nearest sources of that to here are the Hudson Valley of New York. So that material was transported for approximately 200 miles just to get here. So we only find that in small amounts, but it was present in the Sandhill material. That slide shows a little cluster of fragments of quartz chipping debris, a little lithic workshop area in the Sandhill site. Oh, there. I think that went backwards, yeah. There we go, okay. The chipstone tools are primarily the projectile points I talked about, the spear points. These are examples of some of the oldest projectile points from the Sandhill site. This is a single Middle Archaic point, the Stark type, approximately 7,000 years old. And then the top row are these kind of eared triangular points that are called Brewerton style points, about 4,500 to 4,000 years old. I think all or most of these points in this slide were made out of local quartzite. It's a formation called the Westboro quartzite. And it's in a band that extends from Worcester County. It's kind of northeast through this area. And that was a primary material for stone tool making. So these are some of the oldest artifacts from the site. Late Archaic period, again, about 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. Small triangular points made out of quartz that archaeologists call squib-knocket triangle type points, about 4,500 to 4,000 years old. There's quite a lot of those in the site. Small stem points, pretty much approximately the same time frame, but they continue a little bit later. Again, mostly made out of quartz. That's common for that time period and cultural tradition. Oops. Which is Gerald's. Oh, it's going back. That's right, that's good. This is a set of 4 points that are called Atlantic type points by archaeologists in New England. They belong to a very specific late archaic period cultural tradition called the Susquehanna tradition because it was first identified in Pennsylvania. It's a very distinct technology. And what's interesting around here is that this Susquehanna tradition and the cultural tradition, the people that made all those little quartz triangles and small stem points, they shared the same landscape at the same time. And that's one of the big mysteries, one of the big questions that has not been answered is how did they get that to work? Because the stone tool making technologies and the entire cultures were very, very different. So it's one of the really intriguing, yet unanswered questions. In Wayland, there was a very famous Susquehanna tradition cremation burial cemetery called the Mansion Inn site, which was actually accidentally discovered by an amateur archaeologist who was a Wayland resident in, I'm going to say 1956. And that turned out to be a regionally significant archaeological site for virtually all of the Northeast, but certainly all of New England. It was a complex of late archaic period Susquehanna tradition cremation burial features that were probably about 3,600 to 3,200 years old. And that was a very rough salvage operation because some people would say it was looted before professional archaeologists could get to it, but a lot of information was recovered from it. But it certainly put Wayland on the map, the archaeology map for New England. And we still refer to that site frequently. Sandhill site has this terminal archaic early woodland period component on it. And I'll show you in the next couple of slides the ceramic sherds. We're not sure, but we're guessing that some of these stemmed points belong to that general time frame about 3,000 to 2,500 years ago. That's just a guess. This is kind of a tough time period because we don't have any really clearly diagnostic points, but we know from radiocarbon dating that Native Americans did continue to make these kind of lanceolate stemmed points into that period. Go backwards. One more. Okay, yes, okay. These are just a couple examples of ground stone tools. So a ground stone tool is made by taking a piece of raw material and roughly chipping it into shape. And then you take a hammerstone and you carefully peck little flakes off of it because you're making something that's the equivalent of like a modern woodworking chisel or gouge. And there's quite a bit of skill involved in that. So the object at the top is a ground stone gouge or adze. I'm guessing it's probably at least 4,000 years old. It's interesting because it's made out of that amphibolite material that's really specific to the kind of the Maynard Marlborough area. It's one of the only ground stone tools I've seen made out of that material. Usually projectile points were made out of it. And on the bottom is a fragment of what archaeologists call a semi-lunar knife. If that was complete, it would look like a half circle. And this is just a fragment, but it's a piece of slate that's been ground to a very, very thin edge. I mean, the thickness on that piece might be less than half an inch, and it's pretty diagnostic of the Middle Archaic period. So that semi-lunar knife fragment, that could be 7,500, 7,000, 6,000 years old, somewhere in that time
Is
frame.
the grid 1 inch square?
I think it's 1 centimeter. The question was, what's the grid? And I'm gonna guess it's 1 centimeter
Hmm.
on those slides. A couple more groundstone tools. The object at the top was one of the most interesting artifacts, I think, from really the entire investigation, one of the most intriguing artifacts. It was a ground slate tool fragment, maybe a piece of one of those semi-lunar knives, and it had this kind of intricate and sized design in it. It's a little hard to see in the slide. But that's very unusual to find any kind of decorated stone objects, stone tools in this area. And I remember when that was found, that generated a lot of interest. And then the object in the kind of lower left is a sharpening stone or whetstone. It's probably a slate-like rock and could have been used to sharpen wood or bone objects, bone awl or perforator. Could have also been used to sharpen a groundstone tool. Another really interesting groundstone tool, upper right, that is a wing fragment of a spear thrower weight. So archaeologists use the Aztec term paddle for a spear thrower. So it's basically a wood extension of your arm that you can use to throw a spear with like about 5 times the force that you would normally have. So Native Americans made these stone weights that they would put on these atlatls or spear throwers. And sometimes they're just notched or grooved. This one is perforated. So this is made out of some kind of slate-like rock. And it would look like a butterfly. It'd be like a butterfly shape with 2 wings, and the perforation would go through the central body. And so in the lower left, the blue arrow is pointing to the central perforation. So the weight broke along that midline or perforation. And these are pretty uncommon. It's not something that we find all the time. And the time frame I'm guessing is probably, it's probably late Archaic period, so 5,000 to 3,000, something like that. Then we have rough stone tools. So these are just tools that are made out of, very expediently made out of natural cobbles. Upper frame is a notched weight. Again, this is a really interesting artifact because I pointed out how the Sand Hill site has really good access to the river channel. And it would be a great place to set up fish traps or weirs, or if you were going to set fish nets in the river. So one interpretation of that weight would be that it's would have been used to weight nets made out of some kind of fiber. You could stretch them across the river channel when there's a migratory fish run. And in my experience doing archaeology, just in eastern Massachusetts in general, I've seen very few of those notched weights. That's a pretty rare artifact. But the real interpretive value of it is I think it's a really clear indication of fishing. Like I always think of net fishing. It could be just a single line fishing. Bottom frame hammerstones, those are just cobbles. They're usually kind of hand-sized that were used to manufacture chipstone tools. Are usually made out of hard rocks like quartzite and quartz, sometimes rhyolite. I know there's a number of them in the Sand Hill collection. Come on. You got the touch. Okay, yep, that's the right one. So these are the what's Native American ceramic vessel sherds like when we find them. They're pretty small because the ceramics are pretty soft, they break easily. These are very typical fragments. If that's a 1 centimeter grid on that, you can see that, the biggest one is maybe 2.5 centimeters. So as I mentioned, ceramic manufacture doesn't come into this region till, let's say, at the earliest 3,000 years ago, probably really around 2,500 years ago in what we call the early woodland period. So those ceramic sherds that are in the lower left of that image. I don't know if you can see, there's a cord marked surface. That's what the earliest ceramic vessels would have looked like in this area. It's kind of a rough cone-shaped vessel with a lot of cord marking on the outside. And then later on, I think there's a sherd in that one in the upper left corner. When you get into the Middle Woodland Period, you get this punctate or dentate stamping kind of decoration, that sherd in the upper left. The one in the lower right, that might have a single punctate on it. And then the sherd in the upper right, it's got that incised line through it and some probably little punctates or decorations that were made with a pointed stick. I'm pretty confident that's a late woodland period ceramic sherd. So we're talking about 1,000, maybe 1,200 years ago, up to the period of European contact. Way back at the beginning, when I showed you the breakdown of all the cultural material from the Sand Hill site, and there were those 70 Native American ceramic vessel sherds, this is part of that sample. And that's a big assemblage of ceramic sherds for a Native American site in here, particularly for an interior, non-coastal site. So someday when we do the full analysis of the collection, there'll be a lot of really good information to derive out of just the ceramic vessel collection. Features, as I mentioned, features are things, think of them as like on-site facilities, like fire pits and hearths. They're things that people would have constructed on the site when they got there for various functions, cooking, heating. If you're doing fishing, you're smoking and drying fish, smoking and drying meat. So it's food processing, preparation for storage. There's deep pit features on this site, which could have been just ordinary refuse disposal. The example on the bottom, and in the slides, those black areas, that's charcoal. So that, going back to your question, that's the priority area that we would take charcoal samples from. We would want to collect them from these really discrete features. Because hopefully what we're looking at here is maybe a single event, a single hearth or fire pit that a person or a group created on that site. You know, hopefully it's a snapshot of activity on the site. So I don't have a count of the total number of features on the site, but I would imagine it's probably, I don't know, I mean, I'm gonna just take a wild guess, probably 100, maybe more on a big site like that. But
Sometimes there are plant remains in there.
yeah, that's Tanya's area of expertise is the, sometimes if we're lucky, we find in the charcoal, we find charred floral remains, charred plant parts, things like carbonized hickory nutshell, carbonized acorn, carbonized seeds. So those are real insights into pre-contact Native American diet. And you know, that's the good stuff when we find those. Is there a specific question? You got the magic touch. Yeah, that's it. That's right. Other kinds of features, really common type of feature, on-site feature we find are things made out of burned rock. So again, that could be for heating and also processing whatever food stuffs. If you're drying and smoking fish, you might build a fire, throw a bunch of rocks in it. The rocks retain a lot of heat and good for drying things. it's a pretty common feature type. Sometimes they're pretty large. We find these burnt rock. Sometimes they're almost like pavements. They could be meter, sometimes several meters in extent, where the burnt rock is packed together really, really closely. Probably more like the thing in the top slide. Example of a deep pit feature on the left. Radiocarbon dates. Through the generosity of the town, right?
Yeah.
A lot of radiocarbon dates were done from the Sand Hill site, an amazing number of radiocarbon dates. What else? 28 radiocarbon dates over the period of the excavation since 1987. So every year, the coordinator would, I guess, go to the historical commission and say, hey, you know, we'd like to run some radiocarbon dates from the Sand Hill site. They would get an allotment of money. Usually they would do what, maybe at least 3, 4, 5 a year, something like that.
Sometimes I wonder if he paid for them.
Oh, Paul,
Yeah.
yeah, the coordinator, yeah, Paul Gardesky may have done it out of pocket. That's entirely possible. So of the 28 radiocarbon dates, 23 cover the span from 4,660 to 1,050 years ago, within the prehistoric pre-contact period. So that's basically from the late Archaic period to the late Woodland period. No features radiocarbon dated to 5,000 to 7,000 years ago during the Middle Archaic period. That's not uncommon. In my experience, the sites I've excavated, it's really hard to find features from that time period. We're not really sure why. I know we found deep pit features that we guess are Middle Archaic, but they tend to not have a lot or any charcoal in them, so it's frustrating. It might be something about what people were doing. I mean, it's got to be something about what people were doing. 5 dates from 380 to 40 years. Those are basically modern dates. That parcel of land that the Sand Hill site is on had at least one modern period house on it. So there is some disturbance and intrusion, probably at least from the 19th century, definitely into the modern period. When the town bought the property, there was at least one house standing on it. So radiocarbon dating is a more accurate way of dating Native American use of a site than diagnostic stone tools. Those diagnostic projectile points, the ranges on those can be pretty wide. It could be 1,500 years. C14 dates usually get a standard deviation of plus or minus. Now they're down to plus or minus 30 years. When this dating was done, a lot of the standard deviations were maybe 100 years. But when you do the math on those, you can still get a really good temporal framework for when people are on the site. So they can be used to reconstruct a general sequence of occupation, episodes of site use. And
I want to get that little guy on.
oh, the arrow.
You want to get it down. Oh, here we go. This one, okay.
This is next one. Forward.
That one? No, the other way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that one. This. Thanks. So here's the reconstructed occupation sequence for the Sand Hill site based on the radiocarbon dates. So the oldest occupation from approximately 7,500 to 6,000 years ago, that's the Middle Archaic period date. Actually, we don't have any radiocarbon date for that. That occupation is just from diagnostic stone tools, projectile points, and that semi-lunar knife. Late Archaic period, 4660 to 4,400 years ago. We do have 4 radiocarbon dates in that range. There's 3 cultural traditions inside the Late Archaic period. So the oldest one is the Laurentian tradition. That's probably going to be that 4,600 range, 4,600, 45, 4,400 years ago. 4,300 to 4,000 years ago, solidly Late Archaic, 5C14 dates. Squibnaka triangle, small stem point, assemblage, that's all those little quartz triangles and stem points. And then those overlapping small stem point and Susquehanna tradition people, 3,700 to 3,600 approximately, 3 carbon dates from that general period. Then we get into the woodland period, early to middle woodland, about 2480 to 2110 years ago, 5 radiocarbon dates. I'm guessing it's those small stem points and definitely some of the ceramic sherds. 1400 to 1050 years ago, 6 radiocarbon dates were in the middle to late woodland period.
Duncan,
Yeah,
do these necessarily imply different peoples, or is it?
could be.
They could be different, you know,
Could be.
ways.
The question was,
Yeah.
could these breakouts represent different groups of people? Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in the Late Archaic, where we're talking about that Susquehanna tradition
Mhm.
versus small stem point tradition. Their tool making and really everything that they did are really like night and day from what we've seen
So that
archaeologically.
implies a movement of people.
Yeah, that Susquehanna tradition moved into southeastern New England from the mid-Atlantic area.
Hmm.
That's the current thinking. Inside the woodland period, we don't really have identified cultural traditions. There are probably some ceramic stylistic traditions. The thing that's significant, one of the really interesting things about the Sandhill site is the amount of woodland period activity, because in this area, like in the Sowasco drainage and really in a lot of parts of southeastern New England, we tend to find a lot of our older archaic period activity, but not very much from the woodland period. And we're really not sure why. Particularly in interior areas like where we are here. It's, the archaeological record for the woodland period is really sparse. But we know native peoples were here. Clearly, when the English showed up in 1630, clearly there were native people living here. So that's a big question. So a site like this, where there's evidence of a lot of woodland period activity, that's really of interest. Because it's not something that you see a lot. Just an idea I have is that it may have something to do with the positioning of that site and its utility as a fishing station. Because some of the other sites I've seen around here, where we find some of the strongest, let's say, middle and late woodland period activity, is at places that are really well suited or are historically documented as Native American fishing sites. So for example, inside Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, where the refuge headquarters is in Sudbury, it's on Weir Hill. Now we know that that's a historically documented Native American fish weir site, and there's a narrow constriction in the river channel there. And there's a fair amount of woodland period archaeological activity there. So I'm thinking it might have something to do with fishing. The one thing we know is that the whole Native American settlement pattern underwent some kind of pretty dramatic change after 3,000 years ago. And a lot of it we're thinking has to do with sea level rise, post-glacial sea level rise stopped at about 2,500 years ago. So in the coastal zone, so we're talking about Boston Harbor or the Cape and the islands, once sea level rise stopped and you get the formation of shellfish beds, native people really, there was a major change in subsistence patterns. So in what was food, and shellfish become a big part of diet and subsistence because it's a habitat. You know, it's a major environmental event. And so probably it affected this settlement pattern in the interior. That's what a lot of archaeologists think. I would agree with that. So I think that's, you know, we're only 25 miles from the coastal zone in a straight line distance from here to Boston Harbor, let's say, or the mouth, you know, the Mystic, the Neponset, the Charles estuaries. So we're close enough that probably settlement patterns were affected by that. You know, the cessate, the ending of sea level rise, the shift of subsistence to shellfish. I mean, there's clearly a major settlement pattern shift that we can see. So that's an interesting. So I tried to just come up with some things that are interesting about the Sandhill site in local and larger regional contexts. Similarities, it's like some of the other large pre-contact sites we know bordering the marshes and the Suasco drainage that have these long 8,000-year occupation sequences. We know about quite a few of those. So in that sense, Sandhill is similar to those. It's also similar in size to some of the ones we know about, plus or minus 2 acres, 7,200 square meters. And as I mentioned before, used from the Middle Archaic right up through the Late Woodland Period. It's got that long span, 7,000 to 1,000 years ago. Middle Archaic features are rare, as I mentioned. Most of what we're seeing on the site seems to be from about 4,500 to 3,000 years ago. There's a lot of features. So one of the things that we think is going on in the Late Archaic period is there's a lot of reoccupation of particularly these larger sites. For whatever reason, people are coming back there more frequently. You know, maybe it's multiple times a year. It seems to be a regional pattern. I've seen it on other large river and wetland sites throughout eastern and southeastern Massachusetts, the Taunton, Neponset, Shawshene drainages. And we know that from the radiocarbon dating, the charcoal from those features, that there's these reoccupation episodes. Yeah, less Middle Archaic period use of Sandhill than some of the other larger sites, like Herd Pond in Wayland, Watertown Dairy in Wayland, Castle Hill in Wayland, and Pine Hawk here in Acton. Most of the Middle Archaic activity was on sites that are on these lower, more level locations like glacial came deposits or glacial lake bottom terraces. And Sandhill, as I mentioned, is on the crest of this kind of narrow ridge that might have something to do with it. Sandhill used more in the woodland period than a lot of other sites that we know about. A lot of features dated to the early, middle, and late woodland. It's kind of unusual. Focus of woodland to contact period activity, question mark. As I mentioned in the beginning, the whole Sandhill area is described in, at least in the Sudbury town history, as a former Native American planting field area. So that could account for some of the late woodland, late prehistoric period activity that we see on Sandhill, because it's just walking distance. Now, unfortunately, where those planting fields became the Sudbury landfill. It was gravel pitted extensively, became the Sudbury landfill. It's pretty much gone, except for the Revolutionary War training field off Old County Road. But could explain some of the woodland, a lot of the woodland period activity. So in some, the Sandhill sites clearly significant at local and regional scales as a source of information about a lot of aspects of past Native American settlement. So to bring it up to the current day, what the Wayland Historical Commission and the Wayland Archaeology Group have been doing is working to stabilize the collection. It's really a large archaeological collection, and that's been under Tanya's direction with help from Amanda Giacchio.
Amanda is really heading that up.
Okay, and she's on the Wayland Historical Commission.
She's on the commission
Yep.
in the group,
Yep, and David DeMello.
and Rick
And Rick.
works under her.
Yeah, and David DeMello belongs to the Mass Archaeological Society. He's put in a huge amount of volunteer time. So what happens is plastic breaks down. So when you store stuff in Ziploc bags that were bought in 1982, 1983, 84, after time, plastic degrades, turns yellow. You get off gassing, it gets brittle. So that's what they're working on, is rebagging, taking them artifacts out of the old degraded plastic bags, putting them in new 4 mil, which is an archival thickness Ziploc plastic bag. It's an archival quality bag, and new acid-free archival storage boxes, archival acid-free paper boxes. They're great because they're all the same size. They stack really nicely. Rebagging and boxing the analytical samples, that's the soil and charcoal samples, in case somebody wants to analyze those in the future. And converting the original written catalog to a digital format. And that's where David DeMello's, that's been his focus. And so I get periodic updates from him. And it's a gargantuan task, wouldn't you agree? But he's done a great job. So we're trying to bring the collection up to current curation standards. Because, I mean, again, fortunately, through the support of the town of Wayland, they allowed the collection to be stored in the town building, but it was up in the attic. It's not exactly a climate controlled environment, but it was storage nonetheless. So this is where we are today, is bringing the collection up to current curation standards. And all the archaeology was done under a permit from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, a state archaeologist permit, because it is on town-owned land, and that's a requirement. So I'm on the hook to write as the permit holder. I'm supposed to write the report. It's gonna be a gigantic retirement project, I guess. So anyway, I'll just end it there and open it up for questions.
Did you find any place that these people lived, any hotels or something?
Yeah, actually, that's a good
You have to
question.
repeat every question.
Yeah, the question was, did we find any evidence of, let's say, housing or structures on the site in the form of post molds? And I'm pretty sure there's some post molds. Do you know
I
off the
don't
top?
remember.
Yeah, I think there must be some. It's very, very unusual on these older archaic period sites to find any evidence of housing, of, let's say, a wigwam. I mean, in my career of doing archaeology, we do find post molds. Like, I know there were post molds on the Pine Hawk site, but they didn't really form a distinct pattern. Like, you couldn't link them together to say, okay, this is the outline of a wigwam or house floor. That's one of the really big challenges of southern New England prehistory.
And you have to be able to recognize them.
Right,
I'm not sure that people could always recognize them.
on the volunteers. on the site. Yeah, I think there are some. There's another question.
Well, as far as you know, what is the oldest sites in the New England area that have been documented or dated?
The question was, what are the oldest Native American archaeological sites in the New England region? And the very earliest period of Native American occupation is called the Paleo-Indian period. So we're talking about, let's just say 14,000 years ago, all the glacial ice sheet has melted and retreated into at least northern New England, So we think probably by 12,000 years ago, there are the very first Native American pioneers, as it were, in the New England area. There's been quite a few Paleo-Indian sites identified in New England. I think you had, did you have Bob Goodby come
Yes, he
and
was
talk?
here last year, did he? I thought
Yeah.
he claimed to have the oldest
Yeah.
site,
Yeah.
which they had a lot of post holes too, yeah.
Did they?
Yeah.
Yeah, so an archaeologist who teaches at Franklin Pierce College in New Hampshire, Bob Goodby, found a Paleo-Indian site right outside of Keene, New Hampshire, doing a survey for a new school.
Yeah.
And that is one of the more recently discovered Paleo-Indian sites. It's very significant because those sites are extremely rare. In my entire career, I've only worked on one. And it was a Paleo-Indian site in Canton. And it was it's called the Neponset site. It was found by an amateur archaeologist on a piece of property that was slated for development. That he basically did a salvage on it. There's been some other salvage on it. And I only got to work on it because it was inside a Mass Water Resources Authority sewer easement. So we got to mitigate the sliver of the deposit Paleo-Indian site that was in the sewer easement. But we did find Paleo-Indian material. We found that stone toolmaking technology is very distinct. They used a lot of that chert material, that flint-like material from New York State. They had very specific stone toolmaking preferences. They used a volcanic rock, rhyolite from, that we're pretty sure is from northern New Hampshire. That was a highlight of my career. We radiocarbon dated. We found a very, very faint, like gray stain in the subsoil. We literally used tweezers to extract charcoal out of it. And we ran the date, and we got a date of 10,200 years ago for that site, the Neponset Paleo site in Canton. But the paleo site, there's some in Connecticut, there's several in Connecticut. There's a really famous one up in Ipswich, Massachusetts, the Bull Brook site. That was the first one that was found and really identified in this part of New England. What archaeologists have found is that they're more common in northern New England. So there's a bunch of them up in Maine that have been found in the last 20 years, let's say. There's a few in Vermont, but they're very rare category of site. But that's the oldest. Actually PAL, we found a Paleo-Indian site along the Blackstone River, and we got at least 2 radiocarbon dates in excess of 10,000 years ago. One I know was 11,000. So that's the oldest stuff.
You know, on Bob Goodby's site, he had a small collection of large mammal bone,
Did he?
and I analyzed that.
Oh,
And there was one piece that had a digit of a deer
yeah,
family.
right.
And it was a small piece. And I got in touch with Art Spees about that. He's Mr. Caribou.
He is.
Yeah. So we met at a conference and I showed him that piece and he said, yeah, that is from the deer family.
Yeah.
So I turned it over to him and I said, listen, you know more about caribou. I'm not gonna call it a caribou.
Right.
You can. So he said in his final analysis and the report, he said that it was probably a young one.
Yeah. Wow, that's really.
And the carpenter, we dated the bone,
significant.
and I think it was 10,500, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I would just venture a guess that that's probably the only radiocarbon dated fossil from a New England.
Well, they weren't doing it before
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, so what Tanya's talking about is that Paleo-Indian site that was found outside of Keene, New Hampshire. There was some preserved bone and we know pretty well that because the environment was post-glacial, so it's either a tundra, sort of subarctic looking environment, or you have like just scrub tree vegetation, scrub birch, shrub growth. So the main target of Paleo-Indian economy is caribou herds. And I mean, not exclusively, but that was the main target species. So to find caribou bone is really significant.
There's a question from the remote
Yes.
Zoom people. Diane asks, was there a soapstone bowl tradition in this part of the state?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good question. So that Susquehanna tradition that I talked about, those were the people that tradition moved into the southern New England region, and they brought that soapstone bowl making technology with them from the Maryland, Pennsylvania area. And it's really interesting because it's very geology based. So down in that area, there's soapstone deposits, and not coincidentally, we have soapstone deposits up here in the Worcester County area. So in the towns of Sutton and Millbury, south of Worcester, there are Native American soapstone quarries, and pretty much those were exclusively the people that extracted the soapstone and made these pretty large cooking vessels out of them, among other things. And that's a very distinct cultural marker. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Duncan, you sort of, I'm a fan of the Pine Hawk site, and you sort of first our bow that this one is a lot larger. Are there, is this, was Sandhill one of the bigger ones in New England, or is there yet another tier of?
No, there's bigger sites in southern New England.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is the magnitude of the material that's in it, like the density of the material. Now, that could be a function of the topography, because you only have this restricted area on the crest of that ridge. So it's going to focus the activity. But that doesn't take anything away from Pine Hawk. I mean, Pine Hawk, I mean, to do mitigation data recovery on any of these large sites is really, a special event. I mean, Pine Hawk's really significant for the Assabet drainage. I mean, the Suasco as a whole. But I mean, there's some really interesting differences, let's say in the stone materials that were used on the Pine Hawk site from what we would see even in Wayland. I mean, that's one thing that I remember about Pine Hawk. There's some very,
It was pretty good in the Middle Archaic.
yes, there's a stronger Middle Archaic component on Pine Hawk. I mean, when you go out and look at the display, there's 6 or 7 Middle Archaic projectile points out here in the display. I mean, if we went back and we really fully analyzed the Pine Hawk collection, we would derive a lot more, even more information out of it. So, no, not to take anything away from Pine.
Well, I have a question, because one of the things you highlighted was because that was a community-based project that went on
Right.
for many years and had volunteers, and it seemed like a thorough search.
Yeah,
How common is that in archaeology to
It's
have?
it's not. Tanya can testify to that. And actually, that's a good place to end up, because, when I talk to people from other towns, like for example, there's a group in the town of Medfield, and they have a very similar, their historical commission has an archaeology subcommittee that's been around, again, triggered by a townwide archaeological reconnaissance survey. But, and they have been able to get some investigations done, but there's very few towns where there is that kind of grassroots citizen interest. But, I mean, that would be one of, actually, thank you for asking that, because that would be one of my major takeaway messages from this talk, is that stuff is critical, because, we just went through the post-pandemic era where there was a lot of, it's a low interest rate environment in the economy. And whenever that happens, you get a lot of development. And when you have a lot of development, you get a lot of destruction of archaeological sites. So these grassroots town-based organizations are really important for, like just watching that and monitoring that at the town level. Because those of us like myself who work in the cultural resource management, consulting business, we only work on the projects that go through state level environmental review, that get tagged by the Mass Environmental Protection Act, by MEPA, or a state or federal agency. But that's why the active bylaw is really great. It's really an excellent thing. So yeah, there are other towns. I know in Concord, Shirley Blanca, who a lot of us know, is essentially the Concord town archaeologist. She's at the Concord Museum. I don't think she's not officially, but she functions that way, and she's got some surveys done. But that is really critical.
Did the Big Dig go through all of that?
Yes.
before?
Yeah, PAL worked on a section of the Big Dig. I know there's a podcast on the Big Dig
Oh, is that-
that's out there. Yeah, so the Big Dig, the Central Artery, for example, that used Federal Highway Administration money that was federally funded and permitted. Those kind of high profile projects, they go through a full environmental review, everything. Noise, traffic, wetlands, contamination, cultural, historic and archaeological resources. So there was a lot of archaeology done on the artery. Boston University did a lot of it. PAL, my company, we did the northern section, the Charlestown City Square section. But yeah, that's an example of a large federally funded and state agency project. So that was, at the time, I think they were still called Mass Department of Public Works. It's MassDOT, Mass Department of Transportation now. So yeah, those kind of projects get a lot of.
I just talked to Shirley yesterday,
Did you? Yeah.
and Kathy was with me.
Oh, great.
And
Yeah.
she just finished a book on Concord.
Yeah, I've seen the manuscript.
And so, you saw the manuscript?
Yeah, she said it.
Oh, I'm glad she
Yeah.
did, because she's looking for a publisher now.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, when I talk to people from other towns, I hold up the Wayland Archaeology Group and Friends of Pine Hawk as examples of things that, towns need to do. I mean, there's a constituency in a town that's interested in preserving their historic and archaeological resources. That's what you need to do. You need to organize into these kinds of groups, because otherwise, things just fall through the cracks. I mean, the historic and archaeological resources are just continuously endangered. Particularly these larger sites. I mean, in my career, I have seen so many of these larger riverine and wetland zone Native American sites be destroyed. I mean, some of them we have had the opportunity to study through the cultural resource management process, but there's a lot that we didn't. So there's a lot of endangered archaeological resources. So this town level stuff is really important. And so this were
Yeah,
at the time.
at that time.
Okay,
Questions? I think, well,
any more questions? I can answer them. Okay.
thank you so much.
Yeah.